thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises dot the landscape of our economies, creating more jobs than any other employer in our region beside government. Small business is big business in the Caribbean. From the small grocer to the hair braider, the butcher, the baker, the landscaper, they all provide the services we need and the goods we buy. But very few people know just how significant the contribution really is by Caribbean economies, particularly now with the Caribbean economies in the doldrums. Can Caribbean small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs as they're called, really come to the rescue of Caribbean economies? And if they can, what tools do they really need to do so? Tonight, we focus on repositioning small and medium-sized enterprises for growth in association with the Small Business Association of Barbados. An expert panel is here and ready to get down to business, as it were, on this important issue. Let's meet the panel now. Lynette Holder knows the ins and outs of SMEs. She's also served as the first executive director of the Caribbean Association of Small and Medium Enterprise. And since 2007, she's been the chief executive of the Small Business Association of Barbados. She's joined by Dr. Keith Nurse, an expert in international trade policy, creative economies, innovation governance. He's the executive director of the University of the West Indies Consulting Company. That company provides research, strategy, and enterprise consulting services regionally and internationally. Dr. Nurse has advised several governments and regional organizations, including CARICOM and the Caribbean Export Development Agency. He's joined by Felix Lewis, the general manager of the Center for Enterprise Development in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Felix is a champion of small business in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He's held various roles in the Small Enterprise Development Unit in Kingstown in St. Vincent. And he's joined by Joel Richards, who is an international trade specialist and trade consultant. He's based in Barbados, and he's with the Barbados Private Sector Trade Team. He advises both the government and the private sector on two major trade deals, the Caribbean Community Canada trade negotiations, and he's working on finalizing, at least from Barbados's end, the CARICOM United States Trade and Investment Framework Agreement. In studio, there is a live audience made up of business people from across Barbados and other interested people who want to talk about repositioning small businesses for growth in the Caribbean. We hear from them, we want to hear from you. But all that in our discussion on repositioning small and medium-sized enterprises for growth at a time of risk and crisis in the Caribbean. That's next, here on Carib Vision, after the break.
There's nothing quite like being made to feel special. Like you're the top of someone else's personal hit parade. That's how First Citizens wants each and every customer to feel. Whether it's through innovative products and services, new technologies, or a simple smile, we're always thinking about ways to make your day better and your life a little easier. First Citizens, we put you first.
You want the eyes and ears of your customers? Then there's only one place, Carib Vision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel, and festivals. Advertise on the Carib Vision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Carib Vision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
Brankers on Fontebelle in Bridgetown, Barbados has been for years synonymous with the words reliable, professional, wealth of experience, proven track record, accountability and attentive service, not to mention quality products. Don't miss this month's shipment of exciting new items, all available at surprisingly low prices. Check out Brankers on Fontebelle. It's where affordable luxury lives.
From the CMC Studios in Bridgetown, Barbados, across 23 Caribbean countries and in the New York tri-state area on Caribvision, the CMC's international channel, this is Repositioning SMEs for Growth in our Caribbean with our live studio audience, your contributions, and our expert panel. And I want to begin by talking to our panel about the crisis that you and I have been feeling, and certainly our governments have been dealing with over the past several quarters. Let's begin with Lynette Holder of the Small Business Association of Barbados. Give me an idea of the impact of the economic crisis in broad terms in Barbados, but also in some of the Caribbean countries and the SMEs that you're in contact with and their associations.
Yeah, thanks very much, Julius. I mean, the fact is that many of our SMEs in Barbados, and I believe in the region, are suffering as a result of the high cost of doing business attendant from the global financial crisis. And what do I mean by that? Many of our economies are obviously feeling the effect of reduced economic activity because of the major trading partners that our regional economies do business with, namely the US and the United Kingdom and to a lesser extent Canada. And because of the reduced income, I believe that the small business sector is and has been experiencing also reduced economic activity. And therefore, this, I think, has impacted on their ability to keep the doors open, the ability to be competitive, the ability to maintain the margins that they may have enjoyed before. And because the cost of various inputs have also increased, utility costs, raw materials from some of the trading partners I referred to earlier, I think that these things have therefore meant that small businesses are now suffering from the high cost of these particular inputs in their operations, and therefore the high cost of doing business.
But Dr. Keith Nurse, would you say that the high cost of doing business is something that has plagued our economies and small businesses by extension, even before there was a crisis?
Yeah, very much so. If you look at the ranking of the Caribbean in terms of cost of doing business, based on the World Bank in the indices, we have not been ranking good over these several decades, in fact. Really, the cost of doing business is high in the Caribbean because we are so import dependent for a number of the key inputs. So, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago, most Caribbean countries are highly dependent on imported fossil fuels for everything from transport to facilitating electricity generation and so on. And so, in effect, the cost of doing any kind of business is high because of the import dimension. There's also the high cost of food. So we have a high food import bill into the region, and so consequently, when there's a crisis in the global economy, there's a knock-on effect on the price of food, and so the cost of doing business in the Caribbean.
Felix Lewis, on the ground in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, what are small businesses telling you?
Well, pretty much the same story. We have a difficult period, economic period, that they're now navigating. And many of them, found it difficult. The sales are not at the levels that it used to be. Cost of inputs are going up. However, even notwithstanding that, because some people have been maybe losing jobs in the hotel sector, maybe end up vending on the streets and adding to the competition that is available for businesses. So it complicates matters. And everybody is going through a difficult period right now.
It's hard to measure what you've just described, the hucksters and hawkers, the informal traders, as we prefer to call them. It's hard to measure their impact But are you suggesting to me that small businesses are actually feeling the impact of these informal traders, many of whom are people who are simply out of work, who are now finding ways of making ends meet on the streets?
I think that the depression has affected everybody generally. The downturn in the economy, the low levels of incomes and so on, has affected everybody generally. I was just pointing to the fact that it's already competitive out there, and when we add to those numbers, it just makes it a little bit more challenging for those who do in business. Obviously, even in those circumstances, you find one or two innovative individuals who would find opportunity amidst the chaos that's happening. But those are few and far between. Most people generally move up or down in terms of sales and the business performance based on the level of activity in the economy itself.
Let me bring in Joel Richards. From your perspective in advising the private sector trade team, which is a group of, if I may put it, a group of business people who get together and say to the governments, this is how we want you to negotiate for us on the world trading stage. At a time when foreign direct investment, that's a lovely term that ministers of finance like to throw around, we're getting cash coming in from nice big name investors in brand name brands, big name brands. But foreign direct investment has been falling over the region, across the region for some years now. So does this suggest to you that small businesses now have to take on the brunt of investing in the economy that they serve?
All businesses across all sectors would have to share some of that burden. I think because of the crisis, what we have seen is that individuals and businesses are not investing as they used to. People are holding on to their investments for longer periods of time. However, there are some positive things that have been happening. There has been some softening of the depression environment, so to speak. And so I think what's going to start happening is that small businesses and larger businesses alike would probably start investing again soon. However, I think it is also incumbent on our governments to also continue to seeking those levels of FDI, because we need all engines of the private sector, both our local private sectors and the external private sector, to be firing at this time. And so the small business sector has an important role to play in the entire scheme of things at this point.
Lynette Holder, you have seen businesses coping with these struggles. Have you seen innovation? Have you seen ways of working smarter, not harder, of trying to get around some of these hurdles?
But I think that what automatically happens when we are in these kinds of crises is that business persons will look to see, well, how can they survive? And a part of that approach towards being able to survive includes innovation, includes thinking outside the box, includes doing things differently. And we, in the Small Business Association, have been seeing that not only a person's looking to technology, for example, as a part of their business model that would allow them to reduce overall operating costs, but they're looking as well at the kind of networks that are needed to realize economies of scale and scope. Many persons are drawing on the cluster concept. Persons are coming together across industries, for example, and sharing common services. These are the kinds of things that would allow them, obviously, to reduce their operating costs and still be able to maintain a presence in the market.
But if we're dealing with human beings being the organisms that they're said to be, the selfish gene, yes, one would assume that they'd be so busy cutting each other's throats, they don't have time to collaborate, especially if times are tough.
Well, that may be true, but you know what they say about the whole notion of necessity. At the end of the day, we know that in order for you to survive, there are things that you will be prone to do that will ensure your survivability. And we're seeing that in the sector. Yes, the proverbial issue of not sharing information, not trusting each other and so on is there. But in addition to that, the fact is that we are seeing persons who are desirous of doing things differently and working together so that they can maintain some sense of market share. this is necessary, especially in our services sectors. You know, Barbados is predominantly services oriented, and we are seeing in services persons coming together and sharing, you know, those common services in order to reduce operating costs.
But throughout CARICOM, with one or two exceptions, the economies are services driven, Keith Nurse. So what creativity are you seeing as they provide services to customers?
Well, I think most people don't understand that a crisis like the one that we are faced with presents not just challenges, it actually creates new opportunities. Mm-hmm. Yes. So, for example, the Caribbean's food import bill actually presents a huge opportunity for firms to target that sector. Why? Because if the cost of imported food is rising, then it means the cost of competing with imported food generates new opportunities for entrepreneurs. And the same could be applied particularly to key areas in the Caribbean economy. Energy and energy-related services is a huge area of growth potential. Why? Because we import so much of those services. Switching to renewables becomes a significant opportunity for firms and for the economy in general, in terms of, one, serving foreign exchange, but also generating new forms of employment. The employment rate for renewables is 70% higher than for hydrocarbons. So if we switch away from hydrocarbons into renewables, a whole new range of opportunities, you know, make themselves apparent.
But some of those traditional businesses that depend on fuel oil, and the Caribbean is the most dependent, fuel oil dependent region on earth. So at least that's what the experts say, like yourself. And so many businesses who we report on daily aren't being creative in that sense. Many of them are seeing it as an opportunity to go to government and say, cut taxes, reduce import duties, make the cost of these imports cheaper so we can continue to do business as we were doing it before.
Yeah, but business as usual is not an option any more longer, in fact. And that's one of the things about a crisis of the sort that we are now faced with. It really sharpens the focus. It says to everyone, all the key stakeholders, that business as usual is not something that we can go forward with. So vested interests begin to lose their power in the negotiating framework. And that's why those who are interested in creating new business opportunities need to get their act together. They need to get their script properly developed and argue their case as to why the vested interest framework is not working for the collective. And that's where, you know, the university has a critical role to play in terms of marshalling the evidence, helping to bolster the new frameworks, the new strategic plans, the new business plans that would make the new opportunities a reality.
Pause there for a moment, because the question that will come up inevitably is, while I polish my elevator speech and get ready to make that big business pitch, where's the financing going to come from? Where's that credit? We'll talk about the age-old problem dogging many small businesses, access to money, to borrow, to grow businesses. That's in our next segment here as we reposition small and medium-sized enterprises for growth. Our discussion across CaribVision in a moment.
Barbados mahogany is regarded by experts as the Rolls-Royce of hardwoods. Reggie Medford, a highly honored and recognized artist, has developed a unique and fascinating wood carving technique for this magnificent wood. And you can witness Reggie's remarkable skills at his studio, Medford Craft World. He has the extraordinary talent to transform the roots of the mahogany tree into the most beautiful works of art that you can imagine. And his team of trained artisans shape all manner of quality, worthwhile souvenirs of Barbados. A tour through Medford Craft World is a really interesting and rewarding experience, and the artist himself is always happy to autograph your purchase. So be sure to visit Medford Craft World.
Scotiabank can help you get your business growing. It all starts with a conversation. Talk to one of our business banking advisors today. Scotiabank. Discover what's possible.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, CaribVision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel, and festivals. Advertise on the CaribVision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. CaribVision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
Caribbean Town Hall. We're talking about repositioning small business for growth in the Caribbean. And our discussion started with the situation, the state of play with Caribbean economies in the doldrums and how SMEs are coping, are finding ways of coping, or will be told how to cope given the challenges. But even before this crisis, SMEs, as they're called, have been grappling with this one problem: financing. It's been one of the top areas that researchers say have, across the board, been at the forefront of the small businesses' minds. Let me turn to somebody who tries to help small businesses access financing. What kind of money are we talking about? We throw around these terms about equity financing, venture capital. Let's break some of those terms down. But what really do they want? Do they want a handout of cash and say, go start your business? What really, Felix Lewis, as we begin with you, are they asking for?
I think that the issue is access. Yes. And in many cases, even though you have multiple institutions offering financing to the small business sector, in many instances, they're undercapitalized. So they don't have the volume of cash to adequately address the demand for the finances. I think that is an issue that we really have to address.
When you say access, though, what do you really mean?
Sometimes people approach an institution, try to get funding, even though the institution has funding, for some reason they might get turned down. Some people, maybe they just don't have enough cash to offer the numbers of individuals, the access that they are demanding. So it could be either of those issues. But the access is one of the issues. In some cases, too, it could be just in terms of capacity to do a good business plan, to convince the institution that, listen, I have a good project, and this project deserves to be financed. So that is an issue, access issue also. So it could be a number of these things that could happen that would prevent them accessing the finance.
But in talking to entrepreneurs across the region, many of them have one particular villain in the piece. They're called banks. They have many times turned a deaf ear to the small businesses. You have a different take on it. What's that?
Well, the truth is in St. Vincent, and I guess in some of the other islands, the banks are not the only institutions that offer financing to small business. In our case, we have the National Development Foundation, and we have a new institution established by the credit union movement called Comfy, which is a microfinance company set up by the credit unions to handle the portfolios of small business on a number of those credit unions' books and new businesses in the small business sector. So there are choices in terms of the access. And you find too that these specialized institutions have a more sympathetic ear than the banking institutions in lending to the small business sector. So to the extent that in some of the economies we have those options, it presents a little bit more opportunity for the small business sector to access finance.
Let me put it to you, Keith Nurse, that the issue isn't so much access, but the other big word, the other elephant in the room, risk. In the Caribbean, lots of people don't want to part with their money, and especially at tough times like these. With businesses that are, given the rule of thumb, not only in the Caribbean but elsewhere, they're more likely to fail than succeed.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the data for liquidity in the Caribbean economy, our banks and major financial institutions have a lot of money on their hands. What they claim is that they don't have enough good investments to put those monies into. And really, in many respects, there's a risk aversion within our banking sector, a fairly traditional banking sector that in some instances are prepared to invest or at least facilitate loans in the classic areas of home financing. If you want to buy a car, you can get that easier than if you wanted to invest in a business. Understandable.
Traditional bricks and mortar.
Traditional bricks and mortar, things that can be collateralized or easily collateralized. What is more of a challenge is where the global economy has shifted to, into new areas that are dependent more on intellectual property, for example. Whether you're talking about the creative industries or you're talking about new sectors that embody digital technologies and so forth. Banks don't understand how to collateralize those sectors. And so you have this shift taking place in the global economy, and our banks are a little bit slow on the uptake. And so what happens is that where the risk and innovation is taking place is often in our small business sector. They become undercapitalized because there are no institutions to which they can go to make that leap from being a small business to being a sustainable small business.
But you've done a lot of research on the creative economy, on the filmmakers and the cultural artists and so on, the people who are making new inroads into our economies, but they're the ones who don't have a traditional bricks and mortar business. You can't really collateralize the creative talent of Caribbean people. How do you go about encouraging already risk-averse institutions to part with their cash, particularly when you're dealing with new and emerging enterprises that don't follow the old traditional rules?
Well, you know, in the international market, there are new financial instruments to to measure and to assess the value of intellectual property. And people can use your intellectual property for mortgages now in the global banks. And so what I'm saying is that our banks are a little bit behind the curve when it comes to that. So some of our major artists can collateralize their work and their future earnings through some financial instruments. So those practices exist. They're not hairy-fairy ideas. What we do need, though, is a capacity for our small businesses and emerging businesses to have stronger business planning capabilities. And that's a real big issue. One of the reasons why many of the small firms and SMEs don't get past the third year is because there's no clear plan in place. And there's no support for those firms in terms of shepherding, coaching, you name it, so that they get over that first 3-year hump.
So, Lynette Holder, the problem is not in the stars, and it's not in the angel investors and the venture capital firms that we want to see. It's in ourselves, our inability to keep the books, our inability to map out a strategy, to have a 1-year plan, a 2-year plan, a 3-year plan from zero to breaking even, from zero to profitability, and to be able to present a clear and cogent case for financing from any institution, whether it's a credit union, a bank, or venture capital fund.
I'm going to agree that the issue of the business plan has been a concern in the past. But let me go back and agree that access is a challenge, and the change in our economic construct relative to moving from tangible products now to the intangible is also an issue. But I also think, thirdly, that we have not adequately addressed the different types of financing for the various stages of growth for the business. We traditionally look to the commercial bank for loans at business startup stage. And there's research to suggest to us that the various stages of growth of the small business require different types of financing, and that the commercial bank may not very well be the best source of financing for the business startup. I'm not sure that we have adequately address that and therefore come up with a pool of financial products to cater to the various stages of growth.
So what would you like to see? One fund for startup, one fund for market research, one fund called venture capital, one fund called equity financing. What do you really want?
Ironically enough, you're on the right track. I want to see, I want to see that within our Barbadian and Caribbean context, that our financial institutions, if we can get them to sit and agree, and develop products specifically catered to the various stages of growth and work with organizations like NGOs, like the Small Business Association and others, to help educate the small business person about the various types of financing windows that are available, and thus help them to channel their business plan and their process, their application process, to the institution, depending on the stage of growth. That is the kind of thing that we want to see. What happens now, as we all know, and this is why I think the commercial banks over time have gotten the kind of lashes that they've gotten, is that the business automatically goes to the commercial bank at startup stage. And that's it.
With great respect to Lynette, Joel Richards, is she dreaming?
No, she's not.
Do you think it's possible to have this suite of financial instruments?
Yes, it is. And actually, at the Barbados Private Sector Association, there has been some studies on incentivizing the microfinance sector in Barbados. And one of the recommendations would have been along those lines, to be able to rationalize the different services and products that are offered across the various institutions that are supporting small businesses.
And this is a general question, not aimed at any particular government, but feel free to blame it if you wish. What role do you see governments playing in either helping or hurting business to access those different kinds of financing?
Maybe a bit of both, because to an extent, governments are very involved in terms of providing development capital, concessionary loans and so forth. But on the other hand, government has not been doing enough in terms of the business environment itself, in terms of facilitating small and micro enterprises. So for instance, what are the various things that you need to do in terms of your startup stages? How many applications and permits, and how long do you have to wait for these things? Sometimes that's very onerous. And so to that extent, governments are not helping enough. I'm going to even go to the level of CARICOM in terms of what's being done at that level. Now, there is a revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which is an extremely big document, and there's one article, Article 53, which speaks to small business development. That is insufficient. And so at the regional level, there hasn't been enough attention paid to the development of small and micro enterprises within CARICOM.
But in CARICOM, in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, there's one very big part of that called right of establishment. Any CARICOM national can go into another CSME country and say, look, I want to set up my business. Many people are saying not enough businesses are even looking at setting up another CARICOM.
Yes, that could be true. However, before you branch out, you also need to be able to make sure you're competitive at home as well. If you're not competitive in your home market, it's very unlikely that you will be competitive outside. And so we need to set the structures and put the framework in place at the various national levels to ensure that when our businesses go out, they can also be competitive. I highly doubt that a Barbadian business maybe migrating to another country would be able to access the types of financial resources in those countries as they might be in Barbados. So it's important that in your home market, you're able to exercise some level of competitiveness before you branch out.
How quickly does it take, Felix Lewis, for a business to set up in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? You know, the World Bank has this doing business survey, and it measures how fast. I know there's an initiative within the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States to speed that up. But right now, how long does it take in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to get going?
Well, it depends on the level of business, what type of business, how big the business is, how complicated it is. Because not all businesses require the same level of permits, the same type of administrative processes and so on. So, but
on average?
It's fairly easy to set a business up in St. Vincent. And if you
48 hours, 7 days, 4 weeks?
if you're going to set up a rum shop, for instance, it might be just a matter of buying the rum and getting your liquor license, which might be a week or two, and that's it. So depending on the type of business it is and the level of complexity, and for instance, if you're going to do construction, you need physical planning permits and so on, which would take up some more time.
But Keith Nurse, that's the cost of doing business, is actually the cost of setting up businesses. And lots of small businesses say, it just takes too long to get going, to put in my articles of incorporation. In some countries you can do it yourself, but in many other countries you have to go to 2, 3, 4, 5 different organizations to set up Social Security, to set up business registration, to set up articles of incorporation, and so on. Isn't that still one of the big bugbears in Caribbean business?
Very much so. Almost across the board, but almost very few exceptions in the region. The level of bureaucracy in Caribbean governments is extraordinary. You have to jump through so many hoops to get to the end point. And so it's useful to talk about that, the cost of doing business and so on, but it's also important for us to look at what we call the innovation index. And in that regard, Caribbean economies are also doing quite badly. And this is really more an indicator for the future, whereas a lot of the indicators are backward looking. And in this regard, what we need to keep our eye on is two things. Where are the global markets going to be in the future? And how can we position our firms to participate in that process? And in that regard, we are still trying to operate too many mom and pop operations that are purely locally based and dependent on specialized markets at home alone. What we need to be able to do is diversify our product range so that we can tap into broader market spaces than we now do.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about diversification and innovation and creativity as we navigate how to reposition Caribbean small and medium enterprises for growth. And when we come back, we'll hear from our studio audience assembled here at the CMC Studios in Bridgetown, Barbados, on this special Caribbean Town Hall meeting on small business in the Caribbean.
There's nothing quite like being made to feel special. Like you're the top of someone else's personal hit parade. That's how First Citizens wants each and every customer to feel. Whether it's through innovative products and services, new technologies, or a simple smile, we're always thinking about ways to make your day better and your life a little easier. First Citizens, we put you first.
Brankers on Fontebelle in Bridgetown, Barbados has been for years synonymous with the words reliable, professional, wealth of experience, proven track record, accountability and attentive service, not to mention quality products. Don't miss this month's shipment of exciting new items, all available at surprisingly low prices. Check out Brankers on Fontebelle. It's where affordable luxury lives.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, Caribvision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel and festivals. Advertise on the Caribvision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Caribvision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
Are back in our Caribbean Town Hall meeting on small business. Up ahead, we discuss some of those strategies for repositioning small businesses for growth in the Caribbean. But first, let's take some questions from our studio audience. Let's begin right here.
Thanks, Julius. Michelle Caves, Raptors International of the Caribbean Network. I have a pet, venture capital funds. What role, panel, do you think NGOs, particularly Caribbean NGOs, have to play in either linking with banks or directly offering funds to small businesses, small, medium-sized businesses?
All right, Lynette, you want to take that question?
Well, I believe that there are two key roles the NGO must play. The NGO is first an advocate, it therefore has to lobby on the behalf of the sector that it represents, and we in the association believe strongly in numbers. So as long as you have the numbers, I believe that you're able to, bring your voice to whatever issue you are addressing. So you must be first a strong advocate for your constituents. And secondly, I think that training and education are equally important. The NGO has to be able to provide a framework, either if you have the resources within your own organization or to collaborate with others to do so. But you must be able to train and educate your constituents relative to, as in our case in the Small Business Association, relative to business management and business development. If it is another kind of NGO, obviously the particular nature of operation, but you need to make sure that your constituents are always informed relative to what's happening in their particular sector and have the skills to be able to function effectively.
Just in case somebody just turned on the television in Kingstown, St. Vincent, and doesn't really know anything about venture capital, but wants to know everything about getting into business, define it, and as opposed to equity financing.
Well, the venture capital really refers to the ability of someone, and that someone can be an individual as well as a corporation, purchasing shares in a particular business in exchange, obviously, for having a percentage ownership, if you will, of that particular enterprise. The Small Business Association has some experience with this because in 1997 we would have established a venture capital fund, and I'm seeing the chairman of that particular company in the audience. And the focus, as I said before, was to be able to ensure that small businesses in particular were able to access the funding needed without necessarily having debt financing, because you're selling a percentage of ownership, if you will, through a share issuance in that business to the venture capitalist, and that person or institution then has the opportunity to, bring some degree of skills and technical expertise and so on to the operations of the business. So you're giving up part ownership, as it were, of that particular enterprise.
But that investor isn't coming with just cash, it's coming with perhaps contacts, with access to markets and advice.
The ideal situation is that the investor can bring a sense of technical expertise as well, because they have a vested share in the business and its ability to survive. So they will, come and assist with the overall management and operation and so on of the entity. And I think that that's important for the small business. You mentioned it at the very beginning, that more often than not the small business, is not able to go beyond a year. But if they have that kind of expert counsel and technical advice, they're able to draw on that to help with the overall operation of the enterprise.
All right, let's take another question from the audience.
Osman Macfarlane from New Horizons. Contrary to the discussion, which is actually obtaining capital, obtaining investment, after you obtain the investment and you're ready to launch, one of my problem is, after I meet my potential customers, is that they're not willing to actually take the risk. They're not willing to try something new, what I'm offering. So what's next after obtaining the capital?
Is that a financing issue or is that a business strategy issue?
Marketing, because to me, the first thing you have to do is to make sure that you have a market need for what your product or service you offer. If you have a market need before you start to produce the product or service, it's much easier to make a sale than if you develop something that you like and then try to sell it. It's a much bigger challenge when you try to do something that way than actually developing your business model to suit an existing need.
But let's be frank, how much market research is done in the Caribbean? Besides trying to find out who will vote in the next election or where they will vote. Most people, most businesses, let's be frank, don't have the resources, can't afford to hire a company to do the kind of research they need to know what kind of product, who's going to buy it, and at what price point.
At the small business level, it may not be necessary to have an academic type of marketing study done. It could be just going around in the community and trying to get a feel of what that particular community needs. And that could result in something, an opportunity that exists that you could service.
Keith Nurse, now here comes your creativity question. How creative can we be in doing that kind of market research, particularly when we have a very inexpensive and new and seemingly powerful tool called social media?
Well, emulation is actually the best form of market research, which is if you can identify a firm or an operation operating in another country offering similar service. You can learn from that experience and then adapt it to your local context and scenario. And so, as we say, emulation is the best form of flattery. But the key challenge, though, for many of our firms in the Caribbean is then adding that creative element where you do the adaptation. So are you going to be providing local inputs as opposed to just importing some product from abroad? And many of the firms who are just engaged in pure importing are finding times increasingly difficult. And so the opportunity presented by the crisis is to switch from highly expensive imports into locally available inputs that can provide new goods and services and new clienteles.
The question that many people will pose is quality and guaranteeing that that's the supply of that particular input. It's something that many businesses say they'd rather go to Miami, Florida, and import that ingredient rather than look locally. What would you say to that?
Well, it comes down to increasingly it's a bottom line issue. Many firms are now being pressured by the high cost of imports. And this is not going to go away. Given the escalation in the price of hydrocarbons, fuel in particular, given the high cost of freight and travel, so you're either preparing yourself to get out of business because your customers may be migrating away from your service or good, or you invest in a strategy to lower your costs. And one of the key opportunities that presents itself currently in the global economy is this switching effect. And many countries are doing it. So you can see that, in fact, domestic content is rising in many economies. That's because a lot of entrepreneurs are spotting the opportunities. The question that has to arise in the Caribbean context is, do we have entrepreneurs who can spot opportunities? And this is why market intelligence becomes more and more important. Where we move away from what we call a supply push framework in terms of business strategy to one that's more demand driven, where we are able to say, okay, this is where the demand is and this is where the opportunities are.
And very briefly, is there opportunity then in more business to business kinds of businesses? Businesses that provide direct services, whether it's supply, whether it's maintenance, services of whatever kind, to those businesses?
Oh yeah, there's a huge expansion in business-to-business services. So all the things we talked about earlier, accessing alternative forms of financing, business training and coaching, doing market intelligence, product and quality certification, and the list goes on. Those are a range of services that small businesses increasingly need to participate in a very dynamic global economy. Because even the home economy is part of the global economy.
Didn't hear you mention consulting services, but that was
that was implicit.
A loaded question there, and very bad of me. Let me just take a question from the audience here again.
Charles Carter, Managing Director of Premium Designs. We talk about how important small businesses are to the economy, and the government always talking about foreign exchange. I'm trying to find out if at the governmental level, if any thought is being considered on incentivizing the small business sector which wants to export. Now, if you look at the tourism sector, you will realize that they pay a lesser VAT rate. It's the government.
It's value-added tax.
Value-added tax. They pay less than an average business. What is the government going to do where we could have the potential of these small businesses? Are we going to consider putting them in an incubator program where they can export instead of trying to stifle them in the early stages, so we can actually develop an export small business sector?
Joe Richards, you want to take that one?
Yes, I will. And on the issue of export incentives, now Barbados is a founding member of the World Trade Organization. And as a member of the World Trade Organization, as of 2015, it becomes illegal for for Barbados and several other Caribbean countries to provide incentives on the basis of export performance. So we have to phase out the various export incentives that already exist. However, there are other mechanisms that the government can use to assist firms who are willing to export. For instance, in terms of business development services, there are various agencies within different governments throughout the region that are responsible for small and micro business development. So in terms of the range of services they provide, they have to improve those services in terms of assisting firms with packaging and labeling and understanding market requirements and so on. Those are very important. The whole issue of market research is extremely important as well. Market intelligence gathering. For instance, our organization, the private sector trade team, we assist a lot of firms that are trying to get into export markets to be able to export. So it's not just a responsibility of the government, it's also a responsibility of the various private sector organizations. So for instance, the Small Business Association can offer some of these intelligence services to small businesses who are interested in exporting. We offer some of it as well. But sometimes if you don't know what the different agencies are doing, then you're not going to approach them. So there are different options available. There are also various regional organizations as well that provide funds to assist businesses in terms of becoming export ready. So for instance, you have the Caribbean Export Development Agency that provides grants. You have Compete Caribbean, which is housed within the Inter-American Development Bank. They offer a range of financing options as well, grant funding for businesses, including small businesses. So there are a range of options that can be explored beyond the realm of government. I think sometimes we probably look to government too much to address all of our critical problems and needs.
Let me ask you, what really would you like to see happen? You just heard the WTO is there, so no more cash, no more subsidies, no more handouts directly to businesses. The question I would pose is, the bigger countries are finding ways of getting around that.
Exactly.
But we'll talk
so
about
we have
that
to be
in a
innovative,
moment.
right?
But what would you like to see happening? You mentioned this incubator program, but what specifically, if you can't get cash, if you can't get market support, what would you get?
Well, it's not necessarily cash and these sort of things, because what I have found is when businesses are developing, they need a certain period of time. Dr. Nurse mentioned 3 years. I remember when I started off in business, I thought it was 5, but I've been in business for 10 years, and I could tell you that 5 years is a myth. That was based on the US model, which those firms were capitalized to get to a certain stage. But we have a challenge here in Barbados, as we have discussed, in terms of financing. So that's what we're saying. Instead of saying, well, this is a problem, the banks ain't doing it and stuff like that, why don't we let these small businesses have the opportunity to develop without trying to put on the tax burdens and stuff like that, and let them grow for a 2-year period, a 3-year period, whatever the case may be, especially in the export sector, so that they could develop. So that's what I was wondering, if something like that was being put.
So you mentioned Barbados. Barbados does have a lower tax band for tourism enterprises, services, and so on. Do you want to see a lower tax band for businesses? We just discussed that would be everybody.
Not necessarily. I just mentioned that as an example to show what the government did, because they understood the importance of the tourism sector. But if we are saying that the small business sector is just as important, what are we going to do in terms of trying to get them to develop? And that's why I say it's not necessarily that the government has to do it, but you mentioned Caribbean Export, but Caribbean Export, you have to have a certain amount of the money up front. So if financing is a challenge, you can't expect that the business already has the money to make the investment and then wait to get it back.
All right. I'm going to ask you to respond to some very penetrating questions like that one after the break. We'll come back and talk about more of the challenges that the small and medium enterprises in the Caribbean face, the solutions they're coming up with, and the people they want to help them get the Caribbean repositioned for growth. Back after the break.
Barbados mahogany is regarded by experts as the Rolls-Royce of hardwoods. Reggie Medford, a highly honored and recognized artist, has developed a unique and fascinating wood carving technique for this magnificent wood. And you can witness Reggie's remarkable skills at his studio, Medford Craft World. He has the extraordinary talent to transform the roots of the mahogany tree into the most beautiful works of art that you can imagine. And his team of trained artisans shape all manner of quality, worthwhile souvenirs of Barbados. A tour through Medford Craft World is a really interesting and rewarding experience, and the artist himself is always happy to autograph your purchase. So be sure to visit Medford Craft World.
Scotiabank can help you get your business growing. It all starts with a conversation. Talk to one of our business banking advisors today. Scotiabank. Discover what's possible.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, Caribvision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel and festivals. Advertise on the Caribvision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Caribvision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
We are on Facebook. Join the growing Caribbean community today. Go to www.facebook.com/Caribvision. Be a part of our online family, whether you are located in Canada, the USA, or even farther away. Caribvision is about what it means to be from the Caribbean, our culture, our lifestyles, our voices. Log on or switch us on. Caribvision.
There's nothing quite like being made to feel special. Like you're the top of someone else's personal hit parade. That's how First Citizens wants each and every customer to feel. Whether it's through innovative products and services, new technologies, or a simple smile, we're always thinking about ways to make your day better and your life a little easier. First Citizens, we put you first.
Discussion on repositioning small and medium-sized enterprises in the Caribbean for growth continues with more questions from the audience and an old hand in business in Barbados.
Old hand, huh? I just wanted to carry on from what Lynette had said about the various types of financing, because I think that's very critical for small businesses. And in fact, I think that a lot of small businesses, in fact, make the mistake of believing that financing is about borrowing. But financing really, for small businesses, especially micro businesses, should really come more from sales than anything else. In other words, you should try to build up your selling to get finance. And one of the ways, especially with small producers, is that if you get a job, the idea is to have the client pay you a deposit, because that is financing, and it doesn't cost you any interest. So when you're a startup business, I think the financing should never come from loans because you start off with a burden. It is when you get to a point where you are beginning to be a business, where you're thinking of incorporating and that type of thing, that you then should be looking for financing. And that is where the importance of the business plan comes, because with the business plan and with the experience of 2 or 3 years behind you, it gives a banker a better opportunity to assess you and to be able to see whether you're a viable client or not. So the question I want to ask, and I think it was mentioned just now, small business in the Caribbean is extremely important to the Caribbean. And therefore, the point made by Lynette of not knowing what is required for financing of small businesses is something that needs urgent attention. And in Barbados, I know we have lots of different levels of finance. But for small business throughout the region, we should have some clear mechanism for financing small businesses at all levels. So I would...
Before I bring in Lynette, let me ask you this. What about just access to running credit? You know how difficult it is to chase down those receivables. You know you have to make payroll at the end of the month. You need just that little amount to handle your cash flow as you go from month to month. And that overdraft is all important. Some might argue the cost of that overdraft is too high, or that it's just not enough. And so I'm always treading water, trying to keep afloat when I should be sailing forward. What would you say to that?
Well, as I said, if you really are doing your business properly, you really don't need the overdraft. And I think a lot of people who have gone through this popular business way of having an overdraft would have learned over the years that an overdraft is only necessary when you have big jobs to do. If you got a big job and you need working capital, you need the overdraft for that because your receivable will be coming in later. If you are a retailer and you stocking up for Christmas, you need the overdraft for that purpose. But on an ongoing basis, on a regular way, you really don't need overdraft, because if you are getting business and you are getting your receivables in on a proper basis, then you don't need the overdraft and you will save a lot of money in interest.
But we're in tough times. So the question is, how do you manage that when you know chasing down that money? It's there on the road, as the saying goes. It's there, but just getting it, getting people to pay upon their invoices is always a big issue.
Well, that's something we all have to grapple with. I think that receivables is always a problem in business, and it's a question of managing it. I remember when I started in business, it was very difficult for me to call a customer and ask for money. That's not difficult for me anymore. If you owe me, I call.
You were being too polite.
But you go through a lot of discomfort to call somebody to ask them for your money. And I think that over time in business, you get accustomed that if the receivable is there and you have to collect it, you collect it. Now, I understand clearly as a young business person, the rush to get an overdraft, the rush to get a loan and that type of thing. But I think that it is something that you should really get very good guidance from if you have some friend, because the problems with small businesses also is that very often they need a lot of services that they cannot afford. You need people who can guide you, and you need some assistance from an accountant who might be a friend rather than a professional to you. You might have a cousin or brother who might be a marketing person, and they might be able to help you. That is the kind of thing.
And that has a value.
That has a value, but you don't have to pay out for it at that time.
Absolutely.
Right.
Let's bring in Lynette Holder, and then I want to hear from the rest of the panel about that particular issue of financing. I'm sure you would have a particular comment to make on that, Lynette.
Yeah, the proverbial issue, Senator Watson, is very true. The World Bank studies, the IADB studies, those done by the association and others locally, all point to the issue of financing. And I am of the strong view that we need to look critically at the different types of financing for the various stages of growth. And, I heard the point earlier about looking to government. But the fact is that the government in small island developing states, as we have in CARICOM, needs to play a developmental role. The industrialized economies find all kinds of strategies and ways to get around world trade rules and so on. And we have in the region to be able to do similarly, because there is also a social value, a social input to having a vibrant micro and a small enterprise sector in our small economies. And government, I think, has to provide that kind of developmental framework, and might I say, developmental financing as a first stage. But I want to also disagree with Joel's point earlier relative to export. I don't think that you need necessarily to expand domestically or to be able to perfect your model domestically before you export. There is a born global model and a born global theory that suggests that businesses from the very beginning can be developed primarily for the export market. And I think that a part of our regional strategy at this point in time has to be looking at small and medium enterprises that concentrate from the get-go on exporting goods and services.
You could not have done a better transition to the very next point in this segment, and that's about exporting. We do have, Keith Nurse, a Caribbean community single market and economy. We've signed an economic partnership agreement with the European Union. We've had a long-standing trade deal with the Caribbean, with Canada, and we're trying to improve on that. Now comes a new investment framework. Everybody's talking about economic partnership, no more aid, we want trade. And then there are 5-year, one-way free trade deals with Mexico, Colombia, you name it, in the wider Caribbean. And still, many of the researchers like yourselves are saying that businesses are not knocking on these doors. So the opportunities are there. The documents have been signed by the governments. The businesses are absent from the table. True or false?
This sounds like a multiple choice question.
Well,
and the answer is yes and no, to be a good economist.
On the one hand.
On the one hand, and then on the other. There are a couple of things that we need to take into account. One, our traditional private sector, especially those that were engaged in exports, were producing and exporting largely commodities, low value added commodities for which they were dedicated markets based on preferential arrangements. So we're talking about bananas, sugar, etc. Those markets have declined considerably, and in many instances we've been really knocked out of the market on account of liberalization in trade, but also because our price point, our competitiveness was low, even in those sectors. But those sectors have dominated the landscape, the export landscape in the Caribbean. And in fact, we don't have a tradition of exporting in new areas. And where we do, those sectors are highly fragmented. No strong business support agencies to catapult competitive firms into the global market space.
And the traders themselves don't get together and form associations in some cases.
Well, they do, but they're all fledgling organizations with limited resources and so forth. And so we're really now stuck between an old framework that has declined and a new emerging framework that is under-resourced, undercapitalized, and so forth. And really, we are stuck. And the region needs to break through this framework by doing a number of things. One, we need to find a mechanism for innovative financing. There are lots of financing mechanisms that are being considered all around the world, from crowdfunding to increased angel investing type frameworks. But what we are also seeing is that there's a critical role for agencies like the university to catapult firms to become innovation-driven enterprises by creating the incubator type experience that one of your guests talked about, to help firms that are really going to be at the cutting edge be global players almost from the outset. And that helps to diversify the economy away from its traditional moorings. And that's where I think the real opportunities reside. And that's where I think that the university can play a larger role.
Well, as the University of the West Indies representative there, I'm not going to make you a vice chancellor, but the university is being seen increasingly as being the engine for research and development across these export industries, whether it is making new products or making traditional products sexier for export. Is there enough support, funding for the university itself to do that kind of research and also helping to give businesses that leg up?
By and large, we have inherited a university structure that's premised on legacies and dealing with legacies of underinvestment in human resource development, and so the notion of having a graduate in every household has been the tradition. By and large, we've done a lot of that, but we need to be doing something else as well, which is to facilitate that transition from a legacy university into an entrepreneurial university. Why? Partly because governments can't afford the universities any longer. And secondly, it's important for private sectors and public sectors to become far more dynamic in terms of responding to global demands, as well as demands from our citizenry. And so in that framework, we need a university that can facilitate the growth of startups, that either our staff and our students who are trained can set up a company and have it spinned out from the university. And that's increasingly the role the university has to play going forward. And that's a role that the university has considered for its consulting company.
Okay, we are into our final moments of our program. Yes, 90 minutes really races by. But I want to zero in on that wish list that we've heard of some of it throughout these 90 minutes, but I want our panel to zero in on some of the things that they really would like to see happening, either by businesses themselves and by the organizations that support those businesses to help them to reposition for growth. And I'm going to begin with you, Joel Richards. Give me your wish list. If you had the power, what would you like to see happening? You've had something put on your table about making sure that the governments negotiate differently as they go to another round of world trade talks very, very soon.
Yeah, well, I think a big part of my wish list would be both the issues of financing and business development services. And sometimes firms don't need as much financing as they need access to very good business development services. And so I think we need to equip our agencies to provide those services. Some persons mentioned in terms of having an accountant, access to that, marketing resources, those sort of things, the softer side of things for our firms.
Thank you, Joel Richards. Felix Lewis, 30 seconds.
I think that definitely governments need to commit more resources to supporting private sector development, to develop the institutions necessary to ensure that we take part meaningfully in the globalized economy. I think that even though there's a lot of talk about it, when you look specifically, it may vary from country to country, but some of the countries, when you look at how resources are allocated, there is still a lot to be desired in terms of giving support to private sector development.
Do you want to see the businesses themselves doing things differently in your wish list?
Oh, we need firms that are far more innovation-driven and are prepared to take risk. But some of these are calculated risks, which can be targeted at very key sectors like health, energy, and food. Those are three big sectors that we need to target.
All right. And Lynette Holder, I'm sure you want that to be a to-do list. Let's hear yours.
Yeah, three things, Julius. Access to financing. We need to rationalize and organize the kind of financing that the sector needs. Secondly, there must be a focus on research and development. Yes, collaborating with the University of the West Indies, but more importantly, to get our businesses to understand the value of research and not only for new products, but improving processes as well. And thirdly, the use of ICT. I'm not satisfied that we understand that we're using the technology available to help our businesses to become more competitive in today's environment.
All right, Lynette Holder, you have the last word, and you can find out more about the Small Business Association's week of activities by going on their website, sba.org.bb. But for now, from all of us on the program, thanks for joining us in this special discussion on the role of repositioning small businesses in the Caribbean for growth. It's good night from CMC.